Hello. Welcome to this short video which explains some core principles to help you transition your teaching from predominantly face-to-face to predominantly online formats. The content is brought to you by the MSc in Medical Education from the Swansea University Medical School, but it's really independent of any discipline. It should be useful for anyone who's helping university students learn. The first of the principles then regards expectations. It's really essential to explain to students what's going to be expected of them as they transition from predominantly learning face-to-face to predominantly learning online. You might have to help the students learn how to learn online in a structured, formal way. It's also really important as part of this to promote and enhance engagement and also to keep an eye on the engagement of your students. Design activities which promote engagement online, and we'll talk a bit about how to do that in a second, but also check in on their engagement using some of the simple built-in tools as part of your virtual learning environment, Blackboard, Canvas, whatever it may be. The second principle is probably the most important and possibly the most useful. Although your students may be used to learning in a face-to-face way, coming to lectures and seminars and practicals, they still do a huge amount of learning online already. When they're revising, when they're studying, out of hours, when they're preparing for assessments, they're doing their learning online. The transition then is not quite as significant as you might think it is. The simplest way to think about this and to simple principle to keep in mind when you're making this transition yourself is to think of yourself more as a facilitator who's just making sure the students are safely signposted around the appropriate learning resources as they do their learning. It's less about you being a teacher standing in front of them and telling them what they need to know, and more about just facilitating them doing that themselves. And that's a good principle to adopt anyway, but it's especially important when you think about yourself as an online teacher. It also takes off some of the pressure of thinking that you have to deliver all of your teaching live in the normal way. This brings us on to the next principle then, which is to try and design as many asynchronous teaching and learning activities as possible. Asynchronous just means very simply that they're not delivered live. You record them, post them for the students, and then they complete them in their own time. This saves on bandwidth, it makes technical problems less likely to interfere with the teaching, and it makes them more accessible and flexible. Students complete them when they have the opportunity to do so. I probably don't need to explain to you that at the current time, in May 2020, having that flexibility is really important for all of us. It's far easier for learning to proceed in an asynchronous way than it is to try and get everybody together. Now, there is an important place for live interaction, as we'll talk about in a few slides' time, but try and build in as many asynchronous activities as possible. That also makes it more flexible for you. A key part of that, though, is to make sure that your students are active. Recording a lecture or posting a textbook chapter online and just expecting them to get on with it isn't quite as good as posting some activities that help them make sure they've got the maximum amount out of those learning experiences. Even if you just have a series of lectures, and you break them up, post some quizzes or some tests or some simple formative MCQs, that can really help boost learning through the power of retrieval practice, as we've explained in other videos elsewhere. Other activities can involve them working with each other, doing some simple things designed already as part of your virtual learning environment with minimal technical and practical requirements from you. The next principle then is to try and make sure your learning is bite-sized. There's two forms to this. The first is in terms of the unit of time that we think about teaching proceeding in. We might think of a course or a semester or a module. It's better to break that down into shorter units. For example, weekly recurring cycles of learning. If you give students new activities to do each week in a simple, predictable way, then they're more likely to engage and it's simpler for them. It also brings success and learning closer to where they are in time and makes them more likely to engage and enjoy the experience. It also makes it slightly more manageable for you and allows you to be more present, as we'll explain in a few slides' time. Then when it comes to the individual activities, break those down into much shorter, more manageable chunks. If you've got a 15-minute lecture and you want to record it, supplement it with some quizzes, try pressing just pause on the lecture every 15 or 20 minutes or so and signposting the students to a quiz. It won't take a little bit more work than just recording the lecture in one go, but it's far better for students' attention span and ability to learn and transfer the information. The next principle then is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you've got a series of 20 or 30 50-minute lectures or a whole series of workshops and seminars worked out that are designed to be delivered face-to-face, record them, transition them to an online format using the content that you already have. You don't have to start again and develop shiny new learning resources for all of the content that you want your students to be able to learn. It's okay to use what you've already got. It's also okay to use other people's content, obviously with the appropriate permissions and copyright and intellectual property considerations. If you've got a whole series of learning activities for students, have a look on YouTube or search for open educational resources that address some of those same learning outcomes. It's okay for now, while we rapidly try and transition a whole load of learning to online, to use somebody else's content in the appropriate way, whilst you deliver and design the most important of your own content into an online format. Now, I explained how important it is to try and design as many asynchronous activities as possible, but you do still need to maintain some live and interactive elements to your teaching. It's one of the more difficult and subjective elements of any learning community, but students do learn an awful lot from each other and from interacting with each other. It's really important to try and build that in. Again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Blackboard and Canvas and other learning management systems have discussion boards already built into them. With a few clicks, you can set your students up with a simple activity where they interact with each other. You don't necessarily have to be there or to monitor what they're doing, but they're building and developing on their interactions with each other. It is, however, important for you to be present as a teacher and for the students to be able to get some sort of access to you and some sort of sense of engagement with you as the instructor and the teacher. If you're thinking about this simple weekly cycle of repeated content that we talked about, if you give students instructions about what they're expected to do at the beginning of the week, you could start that with a simple recorded video of you explaining some feedback from the activities from last week and an explanation of what's going to be done this week. It is still important to have live interaction with your students through seminars or one-to-one tutorials, but limit those to when you absolutely need them or when the students are going to get the most out of them. Okay, this one's a little more controversial. It might not feel like it right now, but transitioning your teaching to online is a tremendous opportunity. It's an opportunity to review and revise and refresh your existing teaching, something that a lot of us leave until at the time over the summer when we expect we're going to do it, and then we never have the chance to. Having to transition to online is going to force us to do that, and it's a good opportunity to do so. Once you've developed the content, then it's done. Once you've developed some activities, then they're done, and you can use them again in future years and use that time you've saved in future years to do some other things. The next principle then, the penultimate principle, is that we have to make sure our learning is accessible for all. Applying the principles of universal design will help us do that. Try wherever possible to create one resource that all students can access, regardless of any learning disabilities or physical disabilities or other considerations they might have. Again, existing tools are designed to help us do that. Zoom, for example, will create a transcript. It will put subtitles onto a recording. If you just record a lecture using those facilities, you're going to generate a lot of accessibility features into your teaching. PowerPoint and your virtual learning environment will do a lot of these things as well. We'll put some more detailed guidance elsewhere, but there's a lot that you can do with existing tools to make your learning accessible. And if you apply the principles of universal design, you'll only have to do it once. The final principle then is to keep it simple. Again, use existing resources, use your existing content, build in a few interactive activities, and you're almost there. There's an additional component to this principle of simple, which is that we need to be organized as online teachers. Now, we need to be organized as teachers anyway, we all know that, but some of us, myself included, are perhaps not as organized as we'd like to be. It's more important with online teaching because you don't always have the students all together in the same room. You can't just give them a quick message or an update as you might do in a face-to-face format. Keeping it simple is a good way then of keeping it organized. A simple weekly cycle, for example, students always knowing when the instructions are coming out and what they have to do, and them all being linked to from one central place is a really good way of doing that. There's an additional component to keeping things simple is you don't need bells and whistles. You don't need shiny new learning resources that look very sophisticated and developed to the latest IT specifications in order to develop effective online learning activities. It's what the students do that matters, not the content that they're watching or the content that they're reading. It's what they're actually doing with the content in order to achieve the learning outcomes that really matters. And that can be and should be really simple. Okay, that's all of the components then of the acronym. If you apply those, your online teaching will be totally fabulous, I promise. If you've got any questions, please do send me an email. And if not, I'll see you in another video where I explain this in some more detail. Bye-bye.